Montana Territory, August 1879. The sun was nearly down, bleeding orange over the dry hills, when Weston Dyer saw her running full stride through the open field below his ridge, a baby clutched tight to her chest, hair wild and face streaked with dust and fear. She looked like she had been running a long time. Weston reined in his horse, boots tightening in the stirrups. "What the hell?" he muttered, scanning the horizon behind her. That was cattle land, nothing but open country for miles. No wagon, no horse, just her and that baby. She stumbled, caught herself, kept running. Weston kicked his horse into a gallop, cutting down the slope toward her. When he reached the fence line, she collapsed to her knees in the tall grass, holding the child close. "He's coming," she gasped, looking up at him with wide, panicked eyes. "Please, he's coming." Weston swung down from the saddle. He saw her arms trembling as she held the baby, a boy, no older than 6 months. The woman was no older than 22 herself, maybe 23. Her dress was torn at the hem and stained with dust. Someone had gripped her hard. There were bruises on her arms. Weston stepped between her and the open field. His rifle was already in his hands. "Not anymore," he said. She did not cry, but her shoulders fell like her bones had given out. Weston kept his eyes on the ridgeline behind them. Nothing came, no rider, no sound but the wind and the baby's soft whimper. He turned to her. "Can you ride?" She nodded, shaky but solid. "Yes." "Come on then, we are going back to my ranch." He helped her up gently, careful not to touch her more than needed. She cradled the baby close as he lifted her into the saddle. Weston climbed up behind them and took the reins. He kept one arm around her back as they rode. They reached his place just as the sun dipped behind the mountains. The cabin sat tucked in a bend of the creek, small but sturdy, with a barn and corral nearby. No one else lived out this far. That was how Weston liked it. He helped her down, letting her lean into him when her knees gave. She was barefoot. Her soles were raw. Inside, he lit the lantern and got a fire going. She sat on the edge of the bed, rocking the baby, saying nothing. Weston set out bread and beans, poured her water. She looked up at him finally. "Thank you," he nodded. "I'm Weston Dyer, Willa Rose." The baby stirred. She shifted him to her shoulder. "His name's Peter." Weston nodded again. "He yours?" Willa hesitated. "Yes." He saw the pause but did not press. "You want to tell me who you were running from?" "My husband," she said quietly. "He is not Peter's father. He found out. Said he would kill us both." Weston's jaw tightened. "I ran 2 nights ago. I hid in the dry creek all yesterday, thought I lost him. But then I saw him again this morning, riding east." "Where is he now?" Weston asked. "Behind me somewhere. Maybe half a day." "If he comes here," Weston said, meeting her eyes, "he will not get near you. That is a promise." She stared at him a long time. "Why would you help me?" "Because no man should lay a hand on a woman like that. And because you looked like you needed someone." Willa's eyes filled, but she blinked the tears away. "I did." That night she slept in the bed, baby Peter in her arms. Weston took the floor by the door, rifle beside him. The wind howled outside, but inside was quiet. In the morning, Weston saddled up and rode out at first light, tracking the ridgeline where Willa had come from. He found old boot tracks and a set of horse prints near a patch of broken mesquite. The trail turned south. Whoever the man was, he had not come this way. Back at the cabin, Willa was feeding Peter with a cloth over her shoulder. Her hair was brushed now, tied back. She looked up when Weston stepped in. "I can cook," she said. "Clean, too. If you let me stay until I figure out where to go." "You can stay," Weston said. "As long as you want." Willa looked down at Peter. "He has not cried once today. He knows we are safe." "You are." Over the days that followed, Willa settled into the rhythm of the place. She swept the floors, cooked simple meals, helped Weston repair the chicken coop. When he worked the fence lines, she brought him water. Peter was always close, quiet and watchful with wide blue eyes. One evening, Weston came in with a gash on his arm from barbed wire. Willa took his hand without hesitation, cleaned the cut and wrapped it with a firm touch. "You do not flinch easy," Weston said, watching her. "I have seen worse," she replied, but her voice was soft now. They stood close for a beat too long. He could feel the heat of her skin, the brush of her breath. That night she handed him a blanket and paused. "You do not have to sleep on the floor. I do not mind. I know. But you do not have to." Weston looked at her. "You trust me?" "Yes," he nodded once. "Then I will stay." They lay side by side, separate at first. But sometime in the night, Peter stirred and Willa rolled toward him and her back pressed to Weston's chest. She did not move away, neither did he. In the morning he woke to the sight of her hair against his shoulder and Peter asleep between them. He had never felt anything like it. Stillness. Warmth. Home. Over the next week, Weston built a second crib from old pine boards. Willa laughed when she saw it. "You made this." "I did." She touched the wood, then reached for his hand. "Thank you for everything." He held her hand a second longer than needed. The next day, a rider came up the trail. Weston saw him from the barn and stepped out, rifle in hand. The man rode slow, eyes scanning the yard. Willa came out of the cabin and froze. "That is him," she whispered. Weston stepped in front of her. "Take Peter inside." She did not move. "Willa," he said, firmer. "Go." She backed into the cabin. Weston raised the rifle. The man stopped 10 feet away. He was tall, with dark hair and a sharp jaw. His eyes locked on Weston. "You got something of mine." "No," Weston said. "You lost them the moment you raised a hand. She is my wife." "Not anymore." The man pulled his pistol. Weston fired. One shot. The man dropped from the saddle, dead before he hit the ground. Willa stood in the doorway, Peter in her arms. She did not cry. She did not speak. Weston walked to her, took her hand, and said gently, "It is over." Her grip tightened on his. That night she sat with him on the porch, Peter asleep in her lap. The sky was clear above them, stars stretching wide. "I never thought I would feel safe again," she said. "You are safe here." She turned to him. "I want to stay. You can. Not just for shelter. I want to be with you if you want me." Weston looked at her, heart full. "I do." She leaned in and kissed him. It was soft, sure, and full of everything she had not said. Weston kissed her back. And for the first time in years, he smiled. The first frost came early that year. By late September, the cottonwood leaves along the creek had turned brittle gold, and the mornings carried a bite that pushed smoke from the chimney before the rooster even stirred. Willa had taken to splitting kindling before Weston came in from the barn. She liked the rhythm of it, the clean crack of the wood beneath the wedge, the way it made her feel capable. Peter sat on a quilt nearby, gnawing on a strip of worn leather Weston had cut for his teething. One morning, Weston stepped into the yard as she brought the blade down and watched her finish the swing. "You keep that up," he said. "I'll be out of a chore." She brushed hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "I don't mind it." He set the milk bucket down and nodded toward the sky. "Storm's coming. Ought to bring the rest of the squash in before it hits." They worked side by side in the garden, hands brushing dirt from thick orange skins, piling them into the wheelbarrow Weston had rebuilt from scrap iron and pine. Willa moved with quiet certainty now. Her sleeves were rolled, and her skirts tied back with twine to keep them clear of the rows. "You know," Weston said after a while, "when I was 16, I thought I'd head to Oregon. Heard a man could stake a claim and build on untouched land. Never made it past Wyoming territory." Willa looked up from the vine she was tugging. "Why not? Got work with a cattle outfit. Then that turned into another. I kept telling myself I'd go the next spring, but the trail kept pulling another way." She studied him a moment. Do you regret it? He stood and ran a hand over his mouth. Not anymore. When the first snow fell, it came quiet. Just after sundown, while Peter was curled in Willa's lap, Weston opened the door to check the horses and paused. "Come see," he said. She carried Peter to the threshold. Flakes drifted down, catching in the lamplight like ash. The corral fence wore a thin line of white, and the wind had gone still, like even the sky was holding its breath. Peter reached toward it, his fingers opening and closing. "He's never seen snow," Willa said. "Neither had I till I was 12. First time I saw it, I thought the world was ending," she smiled. "He doesn't look scared." "No," Weston said, watching the boy's wonder. "He doesn't." Later, after the fire had burned low and the baby was asleep in the cradle Weston had carved, Willa stood by the hearth rubbing beeswax into her hands. Her palms had cracked from the cold, and she worked the salve in slowly, her back to Weston. "I'd like to marry you," she said, voice steady. He looked up from the floor where he was mending a saddle strap. "You would?" She turned around. "Yes." He stood, slow and deliberate. "You sure?" "I am." He crossed the floor and took her hands gently in his. "Then let's do it right." They rode to the nearest town 2 days later, bundled against the wind. It was a hardscrabble place, one street, a church, a store, a smithy, and not much else. The preacher was a man Weston had known from cattle drives, and he agreed to marry them under the cottonwood tree behind the church, the last of its leaves spinning down around them. Willa wore a wool dress she had altered herself, with a ribbon Weston had bought from the mercantile tucked into her braid. Peter watched from the crook of Weston's arm, bundled tight in a quilt and blinking at the sky. They spoke their vows with simple words, hands clasped, eyes steady. Afterward, they shared a meal at the preacher's table. Cornbread, salt pork, and stewed apples. Willa laughed at something the preacher's wife said, and Weston watched her face soften in a way he'd never seen before, a kind of peace that came from deep inside. When they rode home, the wind had picked up. The sky was streaked in winter blue, and the cold made them huddle close on the horse. Peter slept between them. "Might be a hard winter," Weston said. Willa leaned into him. "We've weathered worse." He didn't answer, just wrapped his arm tighter around her waist and pressed a kiss to the crown of her head. The road ahead was quiet, the hills brushed with snow, and the old cottonwoods lining the creek stood bare and waiting. But their cabin glowed warm in the distance, smoke curling from the chimney. Inside, a fire waited. So did a life. By December, the creek had frozen through and the barn doors stuck in the mornings. Weston took to wrapping his hands in oilcloth before hitching the team, and Willa lined Peter's cradle with wool from the old horse blanket they'd found tucked behind the grain sacks. The days shortened. Chores shrank to what was necessary: water hauled before the pump froze, kindling split to keep the fire steady, animals checked and fed in half-light. They moved through it together without needing to talk much, each knowing what had to be done, each doing it. One afternoon, Weston returned from checking fence posts along the south edge of the pasture with his coat stiff from frost and his cheeks raw. Willa was kneeling by the stove, coaxing heat into a pan of cornmeal. Her dress was damp at the hem from where she'd scrubbed the floor, and her eyes tracked him as he came through the door. "You're limping," she said. He bent to unlace his boots. Slipped on a patch of black ice under the bluff. Nothing broken. She stood and crossed to him. "Sit." He sank into the ladder-backed chair by the hearth. Willa knelt and eased off his boot. His sock was wet through and a dark bruise was blooming near the ankle bone. "Does it hurt to move it?" "Some. I'll be better by morning." "You always say that." He smiled faintly but didn't argue. She wrapped the ankle with a strip of muslin she'd kept folded in the cedar box she used for sewing. Her fingers were sure but gentle. As she worked, Weston brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "You ever think about naming him after someone?" She looked up. "Peter? Yeah, I named him after my father's brother. He was a circuit rider, died crossing the Snake River in flood. My father said he was the only man he ever knew who never raised his voice, not even once." Weston nodded. "That's a good name, then. He deserves a good name." He kept his hand at her cheek another moment, then let it fall. That night, the wind howled fierce across the eaves. Weston's ankle ached too much to sleep, so he sat at the table carving a new handle for Willa's paring knife from a length of black walnut. The old one had cracked down the center. Willa sat across from him with her sewing hoop, patching the seam of Peter's winter bonnet. Her eyes were heavy, but her hands didn't falter. The lamplight pooled between them, catching the smooth curl of wood shavings, the bright thread between her fingers. "You think you'll want more?" he asked quietly. Her needle paused. "Children," he nodded. She leaned back in her chair, the fabric resting against her knees. "I used to think I wouldn't live long enough to raise even one." "You will." She looked at Peter, curled inside a quilt by the fire. "I think I want more, yes, if it's with you." "Then we will." Outside, the wind shifted. Inside, the silence between them was soft, not absence, but something shared. Come spring, Weston started on the new addition. The main cabin was tight with a growing boy, and Willa had mentioned wanting a space to set her loom once she could get one from the trader up north. Weston cleared the ground himself, set the stones for the foundation with his hands. Willa hauled water and leveled boards while Peter played in the dirt beside them. Halfway through May, a letter came addressed to Willa in a worn envelope, the edges softened from travel. The postmaster in town had held it for months, unsure where she'd gone after leaving her husband's property. Weston had stopped in for nails and found it waiting. She stood in the doorway with it unopened, thumb brushing the edge. "From your people?" Weston asked. She nodded. "My cousin." "I wrote her once, weeks after Peter was born, before I ran." He didn't press. Just braced a hand against the doorframe and waited. She read it at the table, lips pressed tight, brow furrowed. When she finished, she folded it neat and laid it beside her plate. "She says they heard what happened. My father disowned me, but my cousin says her door's open if I ever want to come." Weston's chest tightened. "Do you?" "No," she said. "I have a home now. I just wanted to know someone remembered me." He reached across the table and took her hand. She gripped his fingers like she meant to keep them. That summer, the new room was finished. Willa planted sunflowers along the south wall and ran a line of hemp twine between two nails to dry herbs. Weston built shelves for her jars and a little stool for Peter to climb when he got older. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the cottonwoods, Willa stood in the doorway watching Weston toss a carved ball with Peter. The boy giggled each time it rolled wide, toddling after it on unsteady legs. She crossed the yard and slipped her arm through Weston's. "I want to raise him here," she said. "I want mornings with you and wind in the grass and space for him to run." He kissed her temple. "Then that's what we'll have." And they did. By mid-July, the river had swelled its banks with melted snow from the higher ridges, and the cottonwoods stood full and heavy, their leaves rustling like distant rain. The air had thickened with warmth, and Weston had taken to rising before dawn to work the cattle farther up the slope, where the grass still held some green under the shade. One morning, Willa found a garter snake curled behind the flower crate. She didn't scream, just stepped back, fetched the spade from beside the stove, and scooped it out to the edge of the yard. When Weston returned and she told him, he raised an eyebrow. "You didn't kill it. It wasn't hurting anything. Just wanted cool shade." He shifted the saddle off his shoulder. "You always know when to hold still." She returned to the dish basin, sleeves wet to the elbows. I didn't always. Weston leaned against the doorframe and watched her a moment. You thinking of teaching Peter your quiet ways? I'm hoping he picks them up before he starts chasing snakes. That night, they sat on the porch after supper. Peter was asleep in the cradle. Willa had moved to the edge of the doorway where the breeze might reach him. Weston rested with his boots crossed, arms behind his head, eyes on the stars coming out one by one. You ever figure on writing your cousin back? He asked. Willa turned her head, the lantern glow soft on her cheek. I started a letter twice. Couldn't find the words. You want me to take one in when I go to town? I think I'm waiting until there's something worth telling. He nodded slowly. You built a home out of nothing. That's worth plenty. She looked at him then, long and quiet. I suppose I wanted to wait until it didn't feel fragile anymore. Does it still? No, she said. Not now. In late August, a man rode into the yard while Weston was up near the ridge line. Willa was outside washing linens in the trough, Peter playing in the dirt beside her. The man was lean, face chapped from wind, beard patchy. He dismounted slow, hat in hand. Ma'am, he said, I'm looking for a man named Dyer. Fella said he might have come up this way. Willa dried her hands on her apron. He's out with the cattle, should be back before sundown. The man nodded. I'll wait then, if it's no trouble. Willa studied him. You with the law? He shook his head. Just looking for work. I heard he might be needing a second hand. She glanced at Peter, who was trying to fit a stick into a knot in the fence post. You know cattle. 6 years droving for the Babcock outfit down in Wyoming. Got let go when the trail work dried up. She stepped aside. You can tie your horse in the lean-to. Water's in the barrel. When Weston returned, he and the man talked out by the barn. Willa didn't listen in, but when Weston came inside, he set his hat on the peg and washed his hands at the basin. Name's Harlon. Seems honest. I told him we'd try him out through the end of the week. She handed him a clean towel. You trust him? I trust he's hungry and has nowhere else to go. That's usually honest enough. That evening, after they'd finished cleaning up, Weston sat sharpening the drawknife while Willa sorted through a small stack of cloth scraps she'd been piecing into a quilt. I saw how you looked at him, Weston said, not accusing, just observing. She didn't look up from the fabric in her lap. How was that? Like you were measuring. She folded a square along its seam. I was thinking how a year ago I'd have been too scared to stand still and speak plain. Weston set the blade down. You've changed. I feel like I've come back to myself. She met his eyes. But I wouldn't have known how if not for you. He reached across the table and curled his fingers around hers. You did the work. All I did was stand still. She smiled then, slow and sure. By the end of the week, Harlon had proved himself. He rose early, took to the ridgeline without complaint, and didn't balk at digging post holes in heat thick enough to make the horses lather. He kept to himself mostly, slept in the loft above the tack room, and never asked unnecessary questions. One afternoon, Willa found him sitting under the cedar near the split-rail fence, his hat in his lap, staring at the horizon like he was waiting on something to arrive. You missed the trail? She asked. He looked up quickly as if startled someone had noticed him. Some, he said. Mostly I miss not having to think about where I'd become winter. She sat on the low bench nearby, fabric and thread in her lap. You could stay through the cold. We've got the room for another cot. He looked at her, then passed her toward the cabin where Weston was hauling firewood to the porch. Peter's laugh echoed faint from inside. I wouldn't mind that, Harlon said. If it's no burden. Willa nodded. Winter gets long. It's good to have another voice around. That night, after Peter was asleep and the lamp turned low, Weston turned to her in bed and brushed his thumb along her wrist. You sure about taking him in? She shifted closer. I know what it feels like to have nowhere. Weston exhaled through his nose, steady. He's got eyes for you. "I've got a husband who doesn't scare easy," she said, and kissed his shoulder. He pulled her close, the weight of her fitting against him like she'd always been meant to. Outside, the wind picked up through the trees. Inside, the fire burned low, steady, and warm. By mid-September, the fields were dry and rust-colored, and the air carried the smell of sun-warmed hay and wood smoke. The days stretched a little longer than they should have for the season, and the heat lingered like it didn't want to leave. Willa kept the windows open during the day and tied muslin over the cradle so the flies wouldn't bother Peter while he napped. Harlon had stayed on without fuss, taking to the odd jobs Weston didn't have time for, fixing the upper gate latch, oiling the harnesses, clearing brush along the north slope. He worked quiet, ate what was offered, and slept early. He never asked questions about the past, and Weston didn't ask what had sent him wandering so far north. The three of them moved around each other with the rhythm of people who knew their place. Peter toddled now, wide-legged and proud, often with one of Weston's old kerchiefs tied around his neck like a bandit. He'd taken to following Harlon around the yard when Weston was out and Willa was tending the drying herbs. One morning, Willa found Peter sitting beside the water trough, watching Harlon sharpen a blade against the whetstone. "You teaching him bad habits?" she asked, brushing flour from her apron. Harlon looked up. "Just showing him how to keep his tools sharp. He's not two yet." Never too early for a man to learn the value of a clean edge. She laughed under her breath and scooped Peter up. "You can teach him that when he stops trying to chew on the handle." That evening, Weston brought in 2 hares he'd shot near the ridge. He cleaned them behind the barn, hands quick and practiced, and Willa prepared them with sage and dried apple. After supper, with the lamp low and Peter already asleep, she leaned her elbow on the table and watched Weston wash the plates. "You ever think about building a smokehouse?" she asked. He glanced over his shoulder. "Wouldn't be hard. Got enough scrap from the last fence job." "Then let's do it." "I want to start saving more for winter. Dried meat would keep us longer than salt pork." He tipped his head toward her, approving. "You want to draw it out, and I'll start cutting the posts next week." They built it 3 days later, the two of them working in quiet harmony. Weston dug the footings, Willa laid the stones, and Harlon helped raise the frame. By the end of the week, it stood just behind the henhouse, a tight, square shape with a vented roof and a heavy cedar door. Willa filled it with strips of venison, rabbit, and the trout Weston caught from the deeper bend in the creek. The smell of smoke and meat hung in the air day and night, sharp and clean. One night, after Peter had fallen asleep with his cheek against Weston's chest, Willa watched them from across the room as she pulled a shawl over her shoulders. "Sometimes I forget how close I came to losing all this," she said quietly. Weston met her gaze. "I don't." She crossed the floor and sat beside him, her hand settling over his where it rested on Peter's back. "You gave me a place and never asked me to explain myself. I used to think I'd never be worth that kind of trust. You are. You always were." Peter stirred and Willa brushed a thumb along his brow until he settled again. "I want to have another," she said. "Not right away, but when the time's right." Weston's hand curled around hers, strong and steady. "Then we will." The first frost came early again. This time they were ready. The cellar was full with potatoes and onions, the smokehouse stacked with meat, and Willa had sewn Peter a coat from an old wool blanket and scraps of deerskin. The boy wore it proudly, stomping through the yard like he owned every corner of the world. One evening, Harlon came in from the barn with his saddlebags rolled and his hat in hand. "I'm heading south come morning," he said. Willa stood from the table, her hands still damp from washing. "You sure?" he nodded. "I've got a brother down near Cheyenne." Figured it's time I stopped drifting. Weston offered his hand. You ever find yourself back up this way, you've got a place. Harlon gripped it firm. You gave me that before I earned it. I won't forget. Willa packed him a sack of dried meat and apples, and Peter toddled after him until the edge of the yard, waving with both hands. Harlon tipped his hat once and rode off without looking back. Winter settled slow, snow coming down in lazy spirals that blanketed the hills and softened the edges of everything. Inside, the cabin stayed warm. Willa baked when she could biscuits, corn cakes, even a pie once with the last of the summer berries she'd preserved. One night, with the wind rattling the shutters and the fire snapping low, Weston pulled a small bundle from beneath the floorboard near the hearth. He handed it to her without a word. She unwrapped it, a silver brooch in the shape of a blooming branch, delicate and hand-etched. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It reminded me of you, the way you came through all of it and still kept growing." She pinned it to her collar and kissed him slow, her hand resting over his heart. "You're the life I never thought I'd have," she said. He kissed her again, deeper this time, and carried her to bed with the firelight trailing behind them. By spring, Willa's belly had begun to round again. Peter talked in short bursts now, mostly names of things: horse, creek, mama, papa, and followed Weston with a fierce determination to copy everything. He was healthy, strong, and full of a quiet joy that mirrored the home around him. The second baby came in late summer, a girl with hair as dark as Willa's and eyes the color of storm-washed stone. They named her Clara. She was calm, watchful, and rarely fussed. Weston built her a cradle beside Peter's old one and carved a small ridge of mountains into the headboard. The days filled with the sound of children's laughter, the crackle of the fire, and the rhythm of two people who had found their way through every kind of weather. Willa often stood in the doorway at dusk, Clara in her arms, Peter leaning against her skirts, and watched Weston come in from the field broad-shouldered, steady, eyes always finding hers first. She knew this life had been earned, not given, and that made it all the more sacred. They lived long and they lived well, through hard winters and dry summers, through growing children and growing harvests, through silence and laughter, through shared work and the kind of love that deepened like roots in the earth. And in every season, Willa and Weston found each other again and again in the small things, in the quiet, in the way his hand always reached for hers. Together, they built a life that held.